Thank you everyone for being here for things your business should know before renting a commercial space. This event is hosted by the New York City Department of Small Business Services with the Commercial Lease Assistance Program in partnership with Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation A. We are excited to have you all here. We have an excellent, robust program for you, and we have a couple presenters from Brooklyn Legal Services. But first, I want to pass it over to Daquan Patterson, who's a program manager at SBS, who will tell us a little bit more about the agency.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here on behalf of New York City Department of Small Business Services. Here at SBS, we're very excited to work with the small business community and helping business owners thrive. We offer a range of services, including finance assistance, training, legal assistance, which you can all find on our website. Navigating government, selling to government, these are all programs housed within SBS. The program that I'm the program manager of is CLA, which is Commercial Lease Assistance. Through this program, we deliver to eligible business owners free legal services relating to commercial lease matters, commercial landlord-tenant issues, and the like. These services are administered through Brooklyn Legal, who we're in contract with, to deliver services and pre-litigation issues. Is there the next slide?
Oh, no, I think that's all for yours, unless you had anything else to go on?
No, I mean, I imagine Bill is going to go into eligibility.
Perfect.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Daquan. Yeah, and then we're going to pass it on now to Bill Angelos from Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation A, and he and Loveleen Zoria will be presenting. Go ahead, Bill. Bill, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for your time. Full disclosure, this presentation is offered for informational purposes only. The information contained in this presentation does not constitute legal advice and does not curate any attorney-client relationship. So what is the Commercial Lease Assistance Program? It is a free legal services available to help eligible businesses with commercial lease issues. It is funded by the New York City Department of Small Business Services. It was launched in 2018 and has served over 25 businesses in all 5 boroughs. What the services includes? It includes such as signing a commercial lease, changing an existing lease, lease review, amendment, assignment, or lease termination, negotiation with new lease renewal, as well as negotiating a rent reduction or rent abatement, resolving landlord harassment or breach of contract under the commercial lease in pre-litigation matters, drafting equitable payment plans, or translate from an oral agreement into a written agreement. Next slide, please. Who do we serve? We serve all New York City small business owners. To be eligible, small businesses must be a small business according to the U.S. Small Business Administration. Generally, a large number of small businesses are eligible, must be located in New York City within the 5 boroughs, including the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and Staten Island, must not be a franchise establishment, such as 7-Eleven, Wendy's, Dunkin's, and we prioritize business owners whose annual income household is below 500% of the federal poverty guidelines, as you will see the chart on the right side of the slide. Next slide, please. What is a commercial lease? It is an agreement between 2 parties that creates an obligation to perform a particular duty. It is much like any other contract, just as leasing a car. So here is a contractual agreement to occupy a commercial space for business or professional purposes. As you notice on the slide, the differences between a residential lease and a commercial lease. Residential leases ensure tenants have some minimum protection, whereas commercial tenants do not have any protections. So in the residential lease, there's regulated protection under the law, legal restriction of rent that landlord may charge, legal requirement you may renew the lease, the duty on the landlord to mitigate any damages, and the right to counsel. Those provisions does not exist in the commercial lease. Why is this important? Because the commercial tenant's protection is based in the lease what they negotiated for. If there is anything that you want in your commercial lease, you must negotiate for these provisions. If the term is not in the lease, then it has no effect. Next slide, please. Generally, landlords will use a boilerplate commercial lease. They use what is called the REBNY form lease, which is the Real Estate Board in New York. It is the most commonly used lease in New York, and it's generally landlord friendly. It is filled with legalese that most business owners do not understand. Commercial leases are by nature much more complex than a residential lease. So it takes a fair amount of knowledge to draft them properly. So when you start negotiating, if there's some term that you're not comfortable in the form, it is best to negotiate early on to modify or change the terms of the form lease. When you modify or change the form or clarify some of the issue on the form lease, we prepare a separate document, what is called a rider. A rider is a separate document that is attached to the lease or to the form lease that contains terms that add, clarify, or replace terms in the form lease. Generally, a written lease will govern the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So it's very important that everything you agree should be written in the lease. If the term is not included, then it has no effect. Next slide, please. A good lease is fair to both sides. A poorly drafted lease can result in handing over far more rights to your landlord than necessary, which may compromise your position. A proper lease ensures that business owners can run and grow their business effectively without unreasonable restrictions or interruption from landlord. Language in your lease should accurately reflect the terms of your agreement. If it's not in the lease, it's not protected. If it's said, not written, it is also not protected. So a well-negotiated and drafted lease may help avoid any potential litigation or issue during the life of the lease. Next slide, please. I will pass this on to Loveleen, whom she will discuss on the lease process and some of the terms.
Great, thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to go through what a commercial lease process looks like. So we start with the small business owner's perspective of looking for a commercial space. Now, you usually find a commercial space through a broker or through a landlord listing. That would be step 2. Afterwards, if you are interested in the property or you're speaking to the broker, more often than not, a broker will encourage you to present a letter of intent. A letter of intent is a document that governs, and we'll discuss this further on in the presentation, just the basic terms that you are interested in agreeing upon. Usually the letter of intent is negotiated by both the landlord and the tenant. Once the terms are negotiated and signed in a letter of intent, they usually govern the lease negotiation process. So it's extremely important that you are in agreement with, let's say, the rent or general terms that are being negotiated, because after you sign it and the landlord signs it, it's extremely difficult to deviate or to change the terms that you agreed upon. Usually that's the beginning of negotiations in the lease. Typically, you'll see negotiations begin with landlord and tenant sort of going back and forth on different terms that they may not have agreed upon in the letter of intent. Or if there wasn't a letter of intent, there would be a straight negotiation. Usually a lease process, as Bill has mentioned, there's a lease and often there's a rider. Sometimes, and more often, all the time, there is a guarantee. And we'll discuss that further on. The last few steps would be lease negotiations, which usually take a few weeks to a month or more. You should definitely request all documents that we will go through in the later slides. It's extremely important once you have done lease negotiations that you walk through the premises and also both landlord and tenant sign the lease. But after both parties sign the lease is only when you should turn over any money, such as rent and security deposit. And then the final step is if there isn't work to be done on the premises, or if there is, depending on what you've agreed upon, you take over the space. Next slide, please. So how do you approach entering into a commercial lease? What are some tips and tricks that you can take into consideration? So small business owners should always take their time. More often than not, there's a lot of pressure on business owners to have their space set up right away so that they can start earning money, that they can start moving forward with their business plans. And a lot of landlords will actually try to push you to sign the lease as soon as possible. But more often than not, when a landlord is pushing you, they're pushing you because there's complicated legalese in the lease. And at times they don't want you to have enough time to review the lease or retain an attorney to review the lease for you. So it does help to take a few extra days or weeks to negotiate so that you can get the space on the right terms, putting your business in the right position for success. Because remember, this lease sometimes is for 2.5 years, 5 years, sometimes longer, and you want to set the relationship on the right foot. Especially given what Bill said, if you don't negotiate for it in the contract, in the lease, you aren't protected. So it's extremely important you have either a lawyer look at it or you review it and ensure that you know what you are signing up for. This is a big thing that we often say, negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. So as Bill said, in a residential lease, there are a lot of protections. However, in commercial leases, there are not very much protections if you do not write it in the contract. But the beautiful thing is you can negotiate at all and any terms you would like. And you get what you bargained for. So if you don't ask for something, you aren't going to get it. If you don't state what you want, you also won't get it. So it's extremely important to ask, even regardless of the perception of the landlord or the broker or the other person. It's important that what you are thinking is heard. Next slide. What should you know prior to entering into a commercial lease? So it's extremely important, like I've said earlier, to know your terms. What are you paying for the rent per month? How long is the lease term? Are you there for 2.5 years, 5 years? How is that calculated? Permitted use. Can you use the space for, let's say, what you're interested in using the space for? A restaurant, a shop. It's very important to know that. You also want to know who is responsible for maintenance and repairs. Who pays for the cost of maintenance and repairs? What sort of insurance requirements are there? More often than not, landlords will require you to carry umbrella policies, general liability, all business interruption insurances. It's extremely important to know what you are committing to getting. It's also important to know what you are personally guaranteeing. So very much personal guarantees, which we'll discuss later on, are you personally guaranteeing all the rent and other items under the lease. So it's very important you understand what kind of guarantee you are signing. Security deposit. Is it for 2 months? Is it for 3 months? How will the security deposit be used? When will it be returned? Those are some things you should ask and know. Are you allowed to sublease the space? So give it to another tenant. Are you allowed to amend, modify any of the terms of the lease? And what does that process look like? And are you allowed to terminate? And what does termination look like? More often than not, the termination is discussed in the lease, the rider, and often the personal guarantee. So you have to check all 3 documents. It's important to know what zoning laws you're dealing with and the certificate of occupancy, because is the permitted use even allowed according to the certificate of occupancy for the space? Environmental laws and limitations that there may be. As I've said earlier, it's really important to access and inspect this premises as best as you can, because more often than not, landlords will require you to take the space as is, meaning just the way it is, and they are not responsible for any sort of problems that come up with the premises after the fact if you have not inspected the space. And then it's important to know who is the property manager versus who owns the building, so you understand the relationships very clearly and who to go for what concerns you have. Next slide. So one of the things we really want to bring everyone's attention to is the different dates that come up in a lease. So a commencement date, a rent commencement date, and a possession date. So a commencement date is when the lease term begins, right? So let's say you sign the lease today, more likely than not, the lease will start June 1st, 2023, and your rent will be due that date. So that would be the rent commencement date, right? Possession date would be, let's say, the date that you actually physically go into the premises and take the keys and start moving into the space. The other things that are important to know is more often than not, most business owners get confused and think that their liability or obligation is only the monthly rent. That is not true. More often than not, there is a bucket called additional rent. And additional rent means there's utilities that you pay for. So water, sewer, electricity, real estate taxes, which Bill will discuss later on, that are all part of your additional rent bucket and also require you to pay on time and, depending on the obligation, sometimes even monthly. There's also something called a build out period. So that's when the space you go into and you want other changes to be made and you're asking the landlord to make those changes, or you're making the changes yourself. More often than not, you should advocate for getting a discount on your monthly rent. So that's what a rent abatement would be. Also, there are late fees that are built into leases. So if you're late for your rent, and there's also grace period. So more often than not, there should be at least a 10-day grace period for your rent. If it's late 10 days, they will wait for 10 days, allow you to remit rent, and then charge you a late fee. And those late fees can range depending on the landlord you're dealing with. As I referenced earlier, a security deposit is a payment a tenant makes to the landlord when the lease begins. This payment does not go towards rent. It is held by the landlord as security against future unknowns that may occur during the lease term. So if you leave the premises and there's damage on the premises, that's what the security deposit is used for. And or if there is concerns around rent not being paid, etc. Next slide, please. So property taxes. It's important that you understand how they're calculated, and Bill will go more deeply into that with examples. But predominantly, you want to know what your square footage that you are occupying is, because more often than not, the square footage you are occupying over the total amount of square footage in the building is a percentage, and that percentage is your responsibility under property taxes. Assignments and sublease, more often than not, a landlord usually will retain the right to say no. If not, they will require you to ask for written consent and require that the person who's taking over your lease meet certain criteria and obligations. It depends on how savvy the landlord is and how many buildings the landlord owns, because their requirements are accordingly. Default and termination. More often than not, a default is when you violate the lease by doing any of the following actions, right? So if you don't pay your rent on time and you've been given notice under the lease and you have still not paid rent, that would be causes for them to say you have defaulted and therefore we are going to terminate the lease. Same thing goes for additional rent. So the utilities, as I mentioned, sewer, real estate taxes, and any violations of any lease clauses. So an example would be you're not carrying the requisite insurance that you need to carry. Personal guarantees and good guy guarantees are basically provisions that you may find in the lease. You may find separate in a guarantee. You may find them in a rider. You have to thoroughly look. A personal guarantee is an agreement by the business owner to take on full personal liability for obligations of the commercial tenant under the lease. So you're paying for, like hell or high water, an unlimited personal guarantee of all the commercial tenant's obligations under the lease. So that is a personal guarantee that is very, very, very difficult and tough. So you're paying for everything personally if the company can't pay for it and the landlord comes and pursues that money from you. A good guy guarantee is if you give a certain amount of notice, anywhere from 90 days to 180 days, more often than not, and you leave the space, you personally are not liable. That doesn't mean that your company may not be liable. It means you personally are not liable. Next slide. So a letter of intent. It's basically a document, as I've referenced, that outlines the general terms and conditions of an agreement before the agreement is finalized. Here, the agreement is the lease. You more often than not want to negotiate this aggressively, because once you have signed the letter of intent, it's very hard to negotiate, as stated earlier. So some of the things a letter of intent will cover is the property, the premises, the dates we reference, how long the lease is, rent, if there is any allowance that the landlord is giving you to improve the space financially, or what you are allowed to do on the space, security deposit, an option to renew. So especially if you want to be here long-term, please negotiate that in a letter of intent. Operation expenses, more often than not, tenants promise to pay a percentage of operation expenses for the building. So it's extremely important you look for this and know what you're signing up for. Utilities, building hours, real estate taxes, and assignment, sublease, and termination. It really helps to have a broker and or a lawyer helping you through this process so you know what you're signing up for. And now I will turn it over to Bill to go through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you. Who paid the building's New York City real estate taxes? Generally, the landlord or the owner pays. However, if the commercial tenant occupies a part of the space, then the commercial tenant will pay his or her portion of the share. As Loveleen mentioned, that real estate taxes is what is category under additional rent. And it's very important for all commercial tenants to be familiar with real estate taxes, because it can be as high as your base rent. How taxes are calculated? It is based on the assessed value of the property. And you will say, what is this value based on? There are three methods. First is the market approach. The second is the cost approach. The third is the income approach. For the purposes of this presentation, most real estate taxes that is assessed upon the commercial tenant is on the market approach. The market approach is what the property was recently sold for, or how much we could have sold for. When it comes to real estate taxes, you must negotiate what is called a base tax year, which determines how much you pay in real estate taxes each year. The New York City Department of Finance assesses the value of each building. They can be found in the New York City Department of Finance Property Tax Bills and Payments website by searching for the building's lot and block number. You will find the building's lot and block number in the lease agreement. As in any property in New York City, the assessed value will always increase, usually increase, and each tenant's real estate taxes will proportionally increase as well. Next slide, please. As Loveleen mentioned, your proportionate share of the building is your total square footage you occupy divided by the entire square footage of the building. That proportionate share of the premises will always remain fixed for the life of the lease. So let's take here, for example. Given the example, if you sign your lease in the first year, which is 2021, you should not pay real estate taxes. For the first year, the real estate taxes is always zero. As you will see in the example, current tax year 2021, 150,000. Base tax year is 150,000. Different is zero, and the real estate tax due is zero. So your base tax year would start at 2021 150,000. So in the following year, 2022, your base tax years remain the same, 150,000. Your proportionate share will also remain the same, 25%. But the current tax year for 2022 is 200,000. The difference between 2022 and your base tax year is 50,000 over the base tax year, times your proportionate share. Your real estate tax due is $12,500. In 2023, in your third year of your lease, the current tax year went up to 250,000, but the base tax year remained the same at 150,000, and your proportionate share again remains the same at 25%. So your real estate tax due is $25,000. As you note that in 3 years, the commercial tenant paid $37,500 in real estate taxes. That is used with the base tax year. Alternatively, commercial tenants may be assessed on a property without using the base tax year. Next slide, please. This calculation shows without the base tax year 2021, your first year. In the previous example, you don't pay a tax. But in this example, in your first year, 150,000 times your 25% proportionate share of the building is $37,500. Year two, tax year 2022, 200,000, 25%, your real estate tax is $50,000. In year three, tax year 2023, 250,000 at 25%, your real estate tax due is $62,500. In 3 years, the real estate taxes is $150,000. Note the difference between the previous slide. Can we go to the previous slide? 3 years, the real estate tax is $37,500. Let's go to the next slide, which is equivalent to the first year, but without the base tax year, $37,500. It is very important for all commercial tenants to understand what they will be paying other than the base rent and operating expenses, which tend to be fixed during the life of the lease, whereas the real estate taxes tend to be unknown when the building has not been assessed yet. Next slide, please. What to do if your business cannot keep up with rent? You need to consider your goals. First is, do you want to renegotiate the rental amount? If you believe your business is viable, but you need some cushion or a break or rent suspension, you can consider renegotiating your rent with the landlord. You want to sublease. You may decide to share the space with another tenant to help you to supplement your rent or pay your rent. You want to assign the lease. You may decide to move to a given space or to a smaller space or to another location with an increase of foot traffic. Or you may decide to terminate the lease if you feel that the business is no longer viable. While you're negotiating your lease, as Loveleen said, you negotiate to consider what you would like to have in your lease. You should also consider of your ethics plan, what you need to do to mitigate your potential exposure. So here, this instance, you want to mitigate, is to lessen or reduce your potential liability or exposure. While you're considering your goals, you need to look at the provision in your lease, whether or not you have negotiated such provision to give it an opportunity to provide an ethics plan. Such as Loveleen had mentioned, an assignment, sublease, or transfer. You need to consider whether or not the lease provides you or permitted you to assign the lease or sublease. Whether or not any remaining liabilities will be on the hook to the commercial tenant, or whether or not it may be mitigated. You need to consider looking at the termination. Look to see whether or not tenants may be permitted to terminate the lease early than the full life of the lease, under what circumstances. Also need to take a look what are required to do prior to leaving the property. You may be required to remove certain specialty alterations you made to the property, such as a kitchen or staircase. You may need to remove all furniture or trade equipment. And personal guarantee. You need to consider what are the terms of the personal guarantee, as Loveleen had mentioned earlier. Or a good guy guarantee. A good guy guarantee is the partial guarantee. And also need to consider what notice that you require to give the landlord and how it should be given, or how many days prior. In a good guy guarantee, it could be 180 days, it could be 60 days, it's what you negotiated for. So when you negotiate a lease, always consider what you need to do to have an exit plan as well. Next slide, please. What you should not do if you cannot keep up with rent. You should not stop paying rent without speaking with an attorney and with the landlord. It is important to speak with your attorney so he or she can advise you what are your potential liabilities may be. And also, you need to speak with the landlord. The landlord will appreciate you be upfront with them, and they may be much more amenable to work with you. You should not abandon the space or leave the space without speaking with an attorney. Because if you abandon or leave the space, you'll be on the hook for potential liability for the rest of the lease. So you need to speak with your attorney to be able to negotiate with the landlord to mitigate your exposure. And the same thing, the next, do not return the keys to the landlord or sign any document without speaking with the attorney. Even the attorney, even the landlord say you can leave, give me the keys, or sign the document, you can go, do not do that. it will be detrimental to you. There may be something in the document that they might want you to read or be aware of that'll be not in your best interest. You may be exposed to any increased liabilities. So it's very important to have an attorney review or speaking attorney to assist you. Next slide, please. Why apply for a commercial lease assistance program? Small business owners are at a disadvantage due to limited financial resources. We can help to level the playing field against commercial landlords who are represented by counsel. Our services are free and give you an opportunity to have a fair chance at having a long-term business space. Having a lawyer involved on your behalf helps to level the playing field. The reason being is that landlord and landlord's attorneys are experienced and savvy people. They do this every day. Also, we do this every day as well, and we can help you level the playing field. Next slide, please. How to register for CLA services. You register by going to the website nyc.gov/COMMLEASE, or you may call us at 718-487-2300, or email us at clahelp@bka.org. Next slide. When filling out the application, it takes about 15 minutes to complete. It is recommended to gather some information prior to signing up. Make sure you get the employee identification number, your business name, your contact information, a copy of your lease, and the start and end date of your commercial lease. Next slide. While you're filling out the application online, you may apply or fill out the application other than English if English is not your first language. There is a drop-down button. You see on the right, say translate, and on the left, on the bottom, you see Spanish or other languages besides English or Spanish. Next slide. If you have difficulty or very difficult to navigate the online application, you can email us or call us. We'll please leave your name, your phone number, your preferred language, and your best time to contact you. And one of our staff members will give you a call and help you and guide you to apply online. This concludes our presentation, and thank you for your time. And we're open for questions.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much, Loveleen. It was excellent. I'll leave this slide up for just a second here. Again, the email, if you want to reach out, is clahelp@bka.org. Our phone number, again, is 718-487-2300. And then, yeah, we'll open it up to questions. If you'd like to ask your question verbally, you can do the raise your hand function on Zoom, and we can unmute you so you can ask it directly to the panel here, or you can type it into the Q&A chat you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we had one question written from before. Someone was wondering if you have never opened a small business before, is it okay to reach out to the CLA program?
Yes, it is okay to apply for our services. You have never opened a lease. And also, I'd like to add, you don't need to have a lease issue. You can call us anyway. We can tell you what the lease says.
Again, if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, or you can add or type your question right into the chat. It will put into If there are no questions, then I think we will probably wrap it up. If you do end up having any questions, please do, again, reach out. Our contact info, again, is clahealth@bka.org. Phone number is 718-487-2300. And I think that should be it. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Loveleen, Bill, and Daquan. And hope everybody has a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.